While headlines focus on Iran's missiles and militias, real power moves silently through ports, energy grids, and trade corridors most analysts barely mention. A 5-part infrastructure network now links ports on the Arabian Sea to the Mediterranean, shaping dependency from Afghanistan to Iraq. These projects look like commerce, but each new contract or pipeline builds something deeper, durable. Leverage, hidden in plain sight. So how exactly does infrastructure become Iran's quiet weapon? And why has almost everyone missed it until now? 5 distinct types of infrastructure form the backbone of Iran's regional influence network. Each plays a specific role, and together they create a system that is both resilient and difficult to disrupt. First are ports and terminals, the gateways, places like Chabahar on the Gulf of Oman, Bandar Abbas at the Strait of Hormuz, and Jask further east. The network extends beyond Iran's borders to include access arrangements at Syrian ports such as Latakia, Tartus, and Banias, as well as usage rights at Lebanese coastal facilities and Red Sea waypoints. These sites handle commercial cargo, oil, and at times military shipments. They provide Iran and its partners with entry and exit points for goods, energy, and influence. Next come land trade corridors. These corridors connect Iran to key theaters, westward through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to the Mediterranean, and eastward through Chabahar, Zaranj, and Delaram into Afghanistan and on toward India. These routes are more than highways. They are arteries for sanctioned goods, weapons, and illicit trade alike. Control over them allows Tehran to bypass choke points and maintain supply lines under pressure. The third category is logistics hubs and warehousing. These are the nodes where cargo is stored, sorted, and redirected. Warehouses near border crossings such as Al-Qim and Abu Kamal on the Iraq-Syria frontier, and bases like Imam Ali in Syria serve as staging grounds for both commercial and military logistics. Here, the IRGC and its affiliates can move missiles, components, and other strategic goods with minimal scrutiny. Energy and transit pipelines, along with cross-border electricity cables, form the fourth category. Iran's electricity exports and grid connections to Iraq, gas pipelines into Iraq and Turkey, and oil swaps and fuel shipments to Syria all build dependency. Prospective pipeline projects, often discussed in government documents and bilateral agreements, reinforce these ties. Control over energy. Supply not only brings revenue, but also gives Tehran leverage during political or economic crises. The fifth pillar consists of financial and contractual ties. The IRGC's engineering arm, Katamal Anbiya Construction Headquarters, and its subsidiaries regularly win large infrastructure and reconstruction contracts in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. These deals are often legal, sometimes dual use, and always strategic. Front and shell companies, sanctions evasion firms, and criminal networks operate in parallel, ensuring that financing and procurement can continue even under international pressure. Together, these arrangements bind local economies to Iranian interests for decades at a time. These 5 categories, ports and terminals, land trade corridors, logistics hubs, energy and pipelines, and financial contractual ties, create the analytic spine of Iran's hidden infrastructure network. Each category is visible in plain sight, yet the way they are stitched together forms a system designed for endurance, adaptability, and quiet leverage. Infrastructure becomes power only when it is turned into leverage, when ports, pipelines, and contracts quietly reshape who decides, who depends, and who yields. 5 distinct mechanisms drive this transformation, each following a clear chain of cause and effect. First, dependency through supply. When a nation relies on imported electricity, gas, or water, the supplier gains a steady hand on the switch. Iran's electricity and gas exports to Iraq illustrate this perfectly. At times, these flows have met 1/3 of Iraq's total power demand. When Baghdad delays payments or faces U.S. sanctions, Tehran can cut supply, causing blackouts and unrest. The pain is immediate. Schools close, shops shutter, and protests erupt. But the real impact is political. Iraqi leaders scramble for waivers, renegotiate contracts, or concede on policy. Dependency becomes a bargaining chip, traded for influence. Second, control of access and choke points. Iranian sway over ports and land corridors, secured by management rights, legal concessions, or informal deals, lets Tehran move goods and people when others cannot. Border crossings, like Al-Qaim and Abu Kamal, and the use of Latakia port, serve as lifelines for sanctioned cargo, weapons, and humanitarian aid. When rivals try to squeeze these routes, Iran's grip on key nodes keeps supplies flowing to partners and proxies, or cuts off adversaries at will. Third, embedding contractors and reconstruction firms. Iranian companies, such as Khatam Al-Anbiya, secure infrastructure contracts in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, often backed by state loans or political guarantees. These projects go beyond commerce. They anchor local economies to Iranian supply chains, foster long-term ties with officials, and provide cover for dual-use logistics. Over time, this creates a network of interests that resists outside pressure and preserves Tehran's reach even as alliances shift. Fourth, sanctions-resistant logistics. Iran operates under international scrutiny by building complex shipping networks, reflagging vessels, and deploying front companies. Oil, weapons, and technology cross borders through doctored manifests, ships that disappear from tracking, and cargo swaps at sea or in third country ports. These tactics keep the network running as sanctions tighten, frustrating efforts to isolate Iran economically or militarily. Fifth, hybridization of licit and illicit networks. The Quds Force and security agencies blend official trade with smuggling, organized crime, and covert finance. Legal contracts and front companies work alongside cash couriers, narcotics, and arms shipments. This blurring of lines makes the network resilient. If one channel is exposed, others adapt and persist. These mechanisms, documented in contracts and shipping records, form a toolkit for quiet leverage. Their effects ripple every time a port opens, a border clears, or a nation's lights stay on because Iran keeps the power flowing. On May 24, 2016, Iran, India, and Afghanistan formalized a new corridor with the signing of the Trilateral Transit and Transport Agreement in Tehran. The treaty's text laid out more than broad intentions. It committed each country to grant access, simplify customs, and uphold transit rights for cargo and passengers through the Iranian port of Chabahar and onward by road and rail. This was not a memorandum of understanding or a handshake deal. The treaty's language spelled out obligations, creating the legal infrastructure for a corridor that could bypass Pakistan entirely and connect the Indian Ocean to Afghanistan's interior. India pledged an investment of up to $500 million to develop Chabahar's Shahid Beheshti terminal and supporting infrastructure. The commitment included new berths, cranes, container yards, and a long-term operating lease for an Indian public sector operator, India Ports Global Limited. Satellite imagery over the following years captured the transformation. New quays appeared, storage areas expanded, and access roads connected the port to Iran's southeastern rail and highway grid. Indian technical teams and contractors worked alongside Iranian authorities, bringing in equipment and training staff for the terminal's phased activation. The legal framework gave India a rare foothold in Iran's port sector, a sector otherwise dominated by domestic or sanctioned entities. Under the agreement, Indian operators received the right to manage cargo flows, set tariffs, and coordinate with Afghan traders. The port's customs and security protocols were harmonized to allow for sealed container transit all the way to the Afghan border, reducing the risk of pilferage or arbitrary delays. Afghan officials, for their part, gained a direct maritime outlet, no longer dependent on Karachi or Gwadar for critical imports. Implementation agreements between India Ports Global Limited and Iran's Ports and Maritime Organization followed the treaty, detailing the operational handover and the structure of joint management. By late 2017, the first Indian wheat shipments to Afghanistan moved through Chabahar, demonstrating the corridor's viability. Afghan exports, dried fruit, carpets, and minerals soon began to flow in the opposite direction, routed through the new terminal under the tripartite transit regime. The Chabahar Agreement stands apart in the region for its transparency and legal force. Its text is publicly available through India's Ministry of External Affairs, and its clauses bind the parties for decades. This is infrastructure built not only with concrete and steel, but with enforceable rights and obligations. The presence of India Ports Global Limited as operator institutionalizes the corridor, embedding it in the legal and economic systems of all three countries. The treaty's architecture forms the backbone for a new trade axis, with the potential to reshape regional supply chains and dependencies. The next phase will test whether these legal foundations can translate into measurable shifts in trade flows and economic leverage. A single wheat shipment in late 2017 set the precedent. Indian cargo loaded at Kandla arrived at Chabahar's new terminal and crossed into Afghanistan by road, bypassing Karachi entirely. Within months, Afghan customs officials began processing containers that had never touched Pakistani soil. This was more than a symbolic gesture. By 2018, Chabahar had handled over 1 million tons of Indian wheat and thousands of containers bound for Afghanistan, according to Indian government statements and Afghan customs tallies. These flows included not just aid, but commercial cargo, food staples, fertilizers, construction materials, essentials for an economy with few alternatives. The corridor's effect is visible in trade data. Iran's exports to Afghanistan reached $1.65 billion in 2022, rising to over $3.1 billion in 2024, a quarter of Afghanistan's total imports. Afghan officials, pressed by border closures and volatility on the Pakistan route, increasingly routed fuel, cement, and food through Chabahar and onward via Nimruz and Herat. For Western Afghanistan, the corridor became a lifeline, shifting dependency from one neighbor to another. AIS ship tracking data, though proprietary, shows a marked increase in vessel calls at Chabahar after 2017. Before the corridor, the port registered sparse commercial traffic. By 2020, Indian-flagged and regional bulk carriers appeared regularly at the terminal, carrying wheat, fertilizer, and construction cargo for Afghan consignees. Afghan customs records where available confirm a steady rise in Chabahar-linked transit declarations, especially during periods of tension with Pakistan. Transit volumes remain small compared to Afghanistan's total trade, but their concentration in basic goods gives the corridor outsized leverage. When Pakistan closed border crossings in 2019, Afghan traders shifted wheat and construction imports to Chabahar, sustaining local markets in Herat and Nimruz. For certain commodities and provinces, the port's share of imports reached double digits. Afghan customs institutions, stretched thin, adapted to new paperwork and digital seals, harmonizing procedures with Iranian and Indian operators to keep cargo moving. The corridor's design, legal, operational, and logistical, has created measurable dependency. Afghanistan, once captive to a single maritime route, now relies on Iran's southeastern coast for a share of its most sensitive imports. Every vessel tracked, every customs form processed, builds a habit of reliance. The numbers are modest, but the outcome is clear. Chabahar has become a lever Iran can pull quietly to shape Afghanistan's economic options. A leaked dossier from Iranian opposition hackers, published in 2024 by the Observatory of Political and Economic Networks, revealed the financial logic behind Iran's quiet push into Syria's port sector. The documents outlined a portfolio of projects managed by Khatam al-Anbiya Construction Headquarters, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps main engineering conglomerate. Among these was a container terminal scheme at Latakia, Syria's principal Mediterranean port. The leaked letter, addressed to then Vice President Mohammad Mokhber, estimated that the combined value of these projects, Latakia's port, phosphate mines at Kanafis, oil blocks 12 and 21, and Syria's Wafa Telecom, could generate $18 billion in income for Iran over 50 years. The figure was not broken down by project, but the intent was clear: secure a long-term revenue stream as compensation for Tehran's wartime support to Damascus. This approach did not rely on open military occupation or overt control. Instead, it depended on embedding contractors linked to Iran within Syria's reconstruction process. Khatam al-Anbiya, already sanctioned by the United States and the European Union for its ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, acted as the institutional anchor. The leaked dossier described the Latakia container scheme as part of a strategic corridor that would tie together energy, minerals, telecoms, and port access. The goal was not just profit, but direct Mediterranean reach, an outlet for Iranian goods, sanctioned cargo, and logistics support to proxies. Unlike Russia's 49-year naval lease at Tartus, the Latakia project did not appear in Syrian legal gazettes as a formal concession. The leaks suggested a looser arrangement, possibly handled through presidential decrees or security channels rather than public law. No full contract text surfaced, but the correspondence highlighted the expectation of privileged access and operational control for the consortium linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This arrangement would allow Iranian entities to manage cargo flows, set handling fees, and control a key node on the Mediterranean, all under the cover of reconstruction and debt repayment. The leaked revenue projection, $18 billion over half a century, was not an idle boast. It reflected a calculation that infrastructure, once embedded, would generate consistent returns and strategic influence long after the guns fell silent. For Tehran, the Latakia scheme was both a business proposition and a logistical foothold designed to endure through shifting alliances and external pressure. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps construction arm stood at the center, its presence justified by contracts, its motives spelled out in financial forecasts. The next layer of evidence would come not from documents, but from the physical transformation of Latakia's port itself. Satellite imagery offers a rare window into how infrastructure quietly reshapes power. At Latakia, Syria's main port on the Mediterranean, a sequence of commercial satellite images from 2015 to 2019 captures a transformation that is difficult to explain as routine maintenance or post-war repair. In early 2015, the container quay at Latakia measured just over 400 meters, with space for 2 medium-sized vessels. The paved container yard behind it covered less than 40,000 square meters, and only a handful of ship-to-shore cranes stood along the water's edge. By the end of 2019, the quay had grown by at least 120 meters, enough to berth a third large container ship. The yard area expanded to nearly 60,000 square meters, with new paved lots and storage blocks visible in high-resolution images. The number of heavy cranes doubled, including the appearance of at least 2 new gantry models not seen in earlier photos. These changes were not cosmetic. Construction phases are visible in the satellite record, with fresh concrete pours, stacks of rebar, and the gradual extension of the quay wall into the harbor. In some images, construction equipment and materials appear under floodlights, suggesting work continued at night, a common tactic for projects that attract outside attention. The pattern of expansion aligns with the timeline of Iranian-linked investment and the deepening of Tehran's logistical interests on the Syrian coast. At the same time, satellite data shows new access roads linking the container terminal to the port's inland perimeter. Warehouses and logistics sheds, some with direct rail spurs and security fencing, appear on previously vacant ground. These facilities are consistent with the needs of a growing container operation, and they also match the requirements of bulk cargo handling and secure, high-value shipments. Crane counts tell their own story. In 2015, Latakia's main container berth supported just 3 heavy lift cranes. By 2019, at least 6 are visible, including models capable of handling both standard containers and outsized cargo. Industry photos and shipping logs from the same period confirm the arrival of new equipment, often coinciding with periods of heightened sanctions pressure on Iran. The physical changes at Latakia are measurable, but their significance lies in timing and scale. Expansion occurred as Iran's need for reliable, resilient Mediterranean access intensified. The port's capacity for containerized and bulk cargo increased by 1/3 in less than 5 years, without a public announcement or formal concession law. The result is a facility capable of supporting not only commercial trade, but also the discrete movement of sanctioned goods and strategic material. Satellite evidence, when combined with leaked financial forecasts and on-the-ground reporting, leaves little doubt that Latakia's transformation was engineered for more than just civilian commerce. The infrastructure tells its own story, one of quiet build-out, new capabilities, and the steady embedding of influence along a contested coastline. Iraq's electricity grid runs on a lifeline that stretches across its eastern border. By 2018, about a third of Iraq's power came from Iran, either as direct electricity imports or as Iranian natural gas fueling Iraqi plants. This dependency was the product of years of contracts, grid connections, and infrastructure deals. On the surface, it promised stability. In reality, it created a vulnerability that could be exposed at any moment. That moment arrived in July 2018. Temperatures in southern Iraq soared past 50 degrees Celsius, and the grid began to buckle. Iran, facing unpaid bills and its own surging demand, slashed electricity exports. Within days, Basra and other cities plunged into darkness. Air conditioning units fell silent, water pumps stopped, and food and medicine spoiled in powerless refrigerators. The blackout quickly escalated from hardship to crisis. Hospitals rationed power, shops shuttered early, and frustration spilled into the streets. Protests erupted, with residents demanding action from Baghdad and relief from Tehran. Inside the Ministry of Electricity, officials raced to find solutions. Emergency meetings ran late into the night. Ministers debated whether to send partial payments to Iran, seek U.S. waivers, or scramble for expensive stopgap supplies elsewhere. None offered immediate help. Years of underinvestment in Iraq's own generation, slow progress on alternatives, and the steady pull of cheap Iranian supply had left the country with few options. The numbers revealed the scale of the problem. At peak, Iraq imported up to 1,200 megawatts of electricity directly from Iran, plus enough Iranian gas to power another 2,500 megawatts in domestic plants. Combined, these flows covered roughly 30 to 35% of Iraq's summer demand. When Iran cut supply, the gap was impossible to fill overnight. Grid managers rotated blackouts, rationed power, and urged patience. But anger only grew as the crisis dragged on. Baghdad was forced into concessions. Emergency contracts were signed. Payments to Iranian suppliers took priority, and political leaders pressed Washington for sanctions waivers to keep the power flowing. The Ministry of Electricity, already under fire for chronic outages, became the focus of public frustration and political bargaining. Each new deal with Tehran deepened the dependency, making future crises more likely and more costly. For Iran, the episode showed the strength of infrastructure-based leverage. A single supply cut triggered economic disruption, social unrest, and political maneuvering in Baghdad. The blackout was a warning. Control over energy flows could shape decisions at the highest levels, embedding Iran's influence deep within Iraq's reconstruction plans. Khatam al-Anbiya construction headquarters sits at the core of Iran's strategy to turn infrastructure into leverage. Founded as the engineering wing of the Revolutionary Guards, it has grown into a vast conglomerate, overseeing hundreds of subsidiaries in oil, gas, transport, and industry. In 2010, the U.S. Treasury formally designated Khatam Al-Anbiya as an IRGC-controlled entity, highlighting its central role in supporting the Guards and embedding Iranian interests in state projects. The official designation describes Khatam Al-Anbiya as a linchpin, operating through a dense web of front companies and sanctioned affiliates to secure economic and logistical footholds across the region. In post-war Iraq, the urgent need for reconstruction created new opportunities. Iraqi ministries, under pressure to rebuild, awarded contracts for roads, power plants, and refineries to consortia that included Khatam Al-Anbiya subsidiaries. Tender documents and press releases from 2017 and 2018 name Iranian engineering firms, some already under US and EU sanctions, as winners of multi-million-dollar deals. One contract from the Iraqi Ministry of Electricity in 2018 put a Khatam Al-Anbiya affiliate in charge of building a high-voltage transmission line from Basra to the Iranian grid, valued at over $150 million. Such deals were often bundled with Iranian state-backed loans or linked to broader energy agreements, making them hard for Baghdad to decline. Each contract embedded Iranian supply chains into Iraq's reconstruction, deepening dependency. Equipment, materials, and technical staff arrived from Iran, bypassing local procurement and deepening reliance on Iranian sources. Payment disputes or delays quickly became political, with Tehran able to threaten supply cuts or demand concessions. Even as the U.S. urged Iraq to diversify suppliers and comply with sanctions, the network of contracts kept Iranian firms in control. When new U.S. sanctions targeted Khatam Al-Anbiya subsidiaries in 2020, the Office of Foreign Assets Control cited ongoing procurement and construction in Iraq as justification. The designation detailed how revenue from these projects flowed back to the IRGC, sustaining both economic influence and military capability. This pattern extended to oil, gas, and transport. Khatam Al-Anbiya linked firms, rehabilitated refineries and pipelines, and built roads connecting Iraqi cities to the Iranian border. These contracts, legal under Iraqi law and approved by ministries seeking investment and expertise, created lasting institutional ties. The infrastructure, the power lines, the roads, and the refineries became physical reminders of dependency, while the contracts locked in financial flows for years. Sanctions sometimes delayed payments or forced renegotiations, but rarely halted work. Khatam Al-Anbiya's network adapted, using front companies and shifting procurement channels to keep projects moving. Economic entanglement was not accidental, but a deliberate outcome, institutionalizing Iranian leverage through reconstruction contracts. Cargo ships bound for Yemen rarely follow a straight path. Instead, they navigate a labyrinth of evasion tactics designed to conceal their true origin and cargo. Automatic Identification System, AIS, data reveals a pattern. Vessels vanish from tracking screens as they approach sensitive waters, only to reappear days later near Yemeni ports. These dark zones are not random. They cluster in the Gulf of Oman, off Somalia's coast, and near the approaches to Hodeidah and Salif. Ships like the Almas and Shaheen have exploited these gaps. In October 2023, the Almas sailed directly from Iran to Hodeidah, bypassing the United Nations inspection regime in Djibouti. The Shaheen flagged to Tanzania, left Bandar Abbas in April 2024, and arrived at Salif 2 weeks later, changing its registration to Comoros mid-voyage. Such flag hopping is routine. Iranian-linked vessels cycle through registries in Tanzania, Comoros, and other flags of convenience, obscuring ownership and complicating enforcement. Ship-to-ship transfers add another layer. Off the coast of Somalia, motherships like the Savis and Beshad anchor for weeks, serving as floating warehouses. Smaller boats, dhows and fishing vessels, draw alongside under cover of darkness, taking on barrels of fuel, containers, or missile components. These transfers rarely appear in public records. Satellite imagery hints at rendezvous, but the details are buried in encrypted manifests and falsified logs. Djibouti's waters, too, have become a favored handoff point, where cargo is shuffled between commercial ships and smaller craft, sometimes with the tacit cooperation of local officials. AIS anomalies are the common thread. Ships go dark in predictable stretches, then reappear with altered paperwork or under new names. Insurance and registry records often lag behind reality. A vessel listed as a bulk carrier 1 week may be operating as a general cargo ship the next, with no clear trail of ownership. Forensic tracking by United Nations investigators and maritime analysts has documented these patterns, but the networks adapt quickly. When direct routes become too risky after a strike on Hodeidah's port or a high-profile seizure, traffic shifts to indirect corridors, with more frequent use of ship-to-ship transfers and longer dark periods. The toolkit is not limited to technology. It relies on front companies, forged documents, and crews trained to evade patrols and inspections. Some vessels make superficial stops at Djibouti for United Nations verification, only to offload sanctioned cargo at unmonitored anchorages further up the coast. The result is a supply chain that is both visible and invisible. Ships and cargoes move in plain sight, but the true nature of their journeys is masked by a web of deception. Each successful run sustains not only the Houthi war effort, but also the economic machinery that funds it, with customs revenues from petroleum imports alone reaching hundreds of millions of dollars in a single year. The next layer of evidence comes from what happens when these tactics falter. When a vessel is intercepted and the true contents of its hold are laid bare. In January 2022, a container ship named MVAAL Italy was stopped by Emirati authorities, with support from the US and the UK. The vessel had sailed from Bandar Abbas, Iran, and carried over 30 tons of missile components, including sodium perchlorate, missile nozzles, and fin assemblies. According to the UN panel of experts on Yemen, these parts were not generic. Serial numbers, lot codes, and manufacturing marks matched components seized in earlier interdictions, down to Persian language labels and proprietary batch codes. Barrels of sodium perchlorate bore markings from Shiraz Chemical Industries, a firm under UN sanctions for its role in Iran's missile program. Missile nozzles carried casting numbers and serials linked to the Shahid Bagheri Industrial Group, an IRGC affiliate. Fin assemblies were etched with Quds Force batch codes and confirmed as Iranian steel through spectrometry. This collection of details formed a clear forensic signature. The UN Panel of Experts, February 2023, report laid out the forensic chain in detail. Investigators compared the seized components to debris from previous missile strikes in Yemen and to cargoes intercepted in the Arabian Sea. The same serial formats, the same casting dies, the same chemical signatures all pointed to a single procurement network anchored in Iran. AIS ship tracking data reconstructed the vessel's route, showing departure from Bandar Abbas on December 28, 2021, a transshipment stop in Oman, and then a sudden gap in tracking as the ship's transponder went dark. When the signal reappeared, the vessel was off Latakia, Syria. Satellite radar imagery confirmed the ship's location and the presence of smaller boats, consistent with offloading cargo for overland transfer. Tracking data and imagery converged. Forensic photographs and tables in the UN annexes documented the markings. Lot codes on the oxidizer barrels, serials on the nozzles, and batch numbers on the fins matched Iranian production records and previous seizures linked to the IRGC Quds Force. The panel ruled out alternative sources, citing the absence of commercial export records and the technical specificity of the components. US and UK intelligence briefings corroborated the findings, citing intercepted communications and satellite data that tracked the vessel from Iran to Syria. The operation was not an isolated event. It was the latest in a series of seizures that, when mapped together, revealed a persistent supply line, one that blended commercial shipping, falsified paperwork, and proxy logistics to move strategic material. The evidence pointed to a coordinated system. The chain of evidence was clear. Serial numbers and manufacturing codes tied the cargo to Iranian state entities. AIS and satellite data traced the route from Iran's coast to the Mediterranean. The UN panel documentation left little room for doubt. Missile parts intercepted at sea were the physical proof of Iran's hidden infrastructure network at work, sustaining its regional partners through a system designed to operate in the shadows, but leaving a trail of numbers, codes, and data points that could be followed from Bandar Abbas to the battlefields of Yemen. Today, pipelines and port leases shape alliances as much as treaties or troops. As sanctions tighten and rivalries deepen, infrastructure isn't just support, it is leverage, currency, and quiet power. Iran's network proves that the next shift in regional order may travel along fiber optic cables and tanker routes, not across front lines. In this age, what goes unseen often decides what unfolds next. Let me know what you think in the comments below.